It's really important what we're going to be talking about today in terms of replacing Darwin's sacred imposter. And in fact, what we're going to be really discussing in terms of all of these things are, went back to this, is mutation selection, our self-destructive compromise. And if I were to ask you, and I'm not even taking a raise of hands here, how many of you believe that evolutionary thinking tends towards atheism? I bet you I would get the vast majority of your hands there. But if I were to ask you, go out to a friend and talk to a friend and explain to them, tell them, how does evolutionary thinking tend towards atheism? And go through the details of how it takes a person who might believe in God and take them over to atheistic thinking, you would probably struggle with that. So, all Christians can take their witness of Christ as the Creator and Savior to the next level by learning three enlightening truths for all of us. The first is this: that creatures and human design things share corresponding engineered features or engineered parts. This is something new, and we haven't been really teaching this for a very long time, but it's absolutely essential that we learn this. Second, that believing in adaptation, and I'm speaking specifically today about adaptation, by random mutations and natural selection is antitheistic because it is anti-design. And number three, the mutation selection explanation harms both science and theology. So these are the main topics that we're going to be covering today, and I think if we get these down, then we'll be able to enhance our witness with others around us. So first, creatures and human design things share corresponding engineered features. And this is what we have to explain. You look at that newborn baby, and all creatures, just like that, have features enabling it to grow, metabolize, reproduce, and adapt. All living things do this. And as Dr. Thomas was talking about this morning, in order for something to be alive, it actually has to do all of these functions. And so it's very difficult for chemistry to become biology because you have to explain every one of these complicated functions within a creature. So looking right off at the very beginning, let's look at several biblical indicators of how creatures operate. And so this is very new. We're going to go right to the Bible and see if it's going to give us any clues about creatures. And right here in Psalm 19:1, it's one that we have memorized, but we only say the first part of the verse very often. The heavens declare the glory of God. But the second part is very important because it says the firmament declares his handiwork. And it's pointing out that God is doing some kind of handiwork. And then in Psalm 8, it says the cosmos is the work of your fingers, and humans are made to have dominion over the work of your hands. And then, of course, in Psalm 9, verse 5, it speaks of the Lord's sovereignty over the creation that his hands have formed. Psalm 102, verse 25 says that God laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Psalm 143, David said, I meditate on your works and I muse, or that is ponder, the work of your hands. And of course in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Paul says, invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. And that Greek word for made there is used only one other time in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, where it says we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. So we have a theme here coming over and over again in the Bible. It says that creation is the work of his hands. It shows handiwork. It shows some type of workmanship. And so this should lead us to ask the question, because of all this repetition, what if this is just not figurative language? What if this isn't figurative language? What if the Lord is giving us a clue of how living creatures are expected to operate? Maybe there's a clue here. Maybe we should be looking at creatures as a form of workmanship. Maybe we should be changing our research methods as all creationists. Maybe we should be setting up our experiments in such a way that we can identify features of workmanship in anticipation that we will find it inside of these creatures there. And then on top of that, when the Lord says that creatures are handiwork, and he says that they are workmanship, My question to you would be this: how do you even know what workmanship and handiwork is? The only way you know what handiwork is by comparing it to human engineered things. This is telling you what workmanship is, and if we can identify features in a human engineered things, maybe we can find those same features in God engineered things. Maybe we've been way off base for such a long time. We should be looking for features of workmanship. And if you look at the picture on the screen with this prosthetic device, the mere fact that it can connect to a human indicates that they both are sharing some engineering features that allow them to do that. Now, that prosthetic device is quite incredible, but the arm that's going to be connected to is even more incredible. And so point number one, maybe we should be looking for features of workmanship. And how do we know what workmanship is? It is always the words. This is teaching point number one. It's always the words which characterize something, which describe it, which tell us what workmanship is. And in addition to that, these words also give an indication about their origins. So if we were to play a game show, and we were to have this side of the room against that side of the room, and I would ask you, what are the top characteristics of design? What kind of words would you use to characterize design? Well, here's one: purposeful. Designs are purposeful. Here's another: regulated. Engineered things are regulated. Here's another characteristic: they're generally very, very complex. On top of that, they usually have results that are highly targeted to very specific solutions. They're orderly. They're specified. They have features which are fitting and suitable for their environment, as if they were planned to be there. And on top of that, they're very, very precise, and they're very, very accurate. So all of these words, all of these characteristics are important, because when you hear those words in your brain, you are thinking what? Engineered and design. Everything is hinging on the characteristics that we give to these words. So when you look at that engine off to the side, and if I were to give you a lot of time to think about it, I would say, write down the characteristics of design that you see. You would write, well, I see numerous interconnected parts. I see a particular arrangement. I see proper alignment. I see moving parts, precise timing. I see exact dimensions and shape. And these characteristics that you see in the engine are what are telling you that it is designed. Now, I am foot stomping this because characteristics are extremely important in conveying ideas about origins. The characteristics convey the ideas about origins. And so when I look at living creatures, and Dr. Thomas covered some of them, the ATPA synthase this morning and stuff, I see DNA maintenance robots that proofread information. They unwind double helixes. They cut and they splice and they rewind and they put things together. I see molecular machines which are doing these things. I see intracellular elevators inside of those creatures. I see mobile brace builders inside of cells that construct tubular just like you would see a human engineer would do. In addition to that, when these cells and other features inside of them are put together, I see other molecules within the cell which act like templates, workbenches, clamps, and vices. And even when I look at the little cellular machines themselves, down at the super microscopic level, I see things inside a cell that act like switches, batteries, motors, brakes, shafts, rods, bearings, bushings, and on and on. I see all of these things operating in the exact same way for the exact same purposes as a human engineered thing. Now, if you could believe that most people, if they could see this, they would probably conclude that these things are engineered. And on top of that, when I look inside of a little plant hopper, his rear legs are connected together by a super microscopic set of gears that correspond in function to human engineered gears. So am I seeing features of workmanship? When the Bible says it is the work of his hands, it says that it is handiwork, are we seeing evidences of handiwork? The answer is yes. So teaching point number 2, and this is really important, and this should change the way you talk with your friends. It's not that just living things are complicated or complex. It's the fact that the engineered workmanship that we see in living creatures that corresponds to, this is really important, it corresponds to the human engineered workmanship that we see in man-made things. That correspondence is the primary and undeniable revelation of Christ's power, genius, and wisdom. So the next time you're talking with friends, you point out that living things have parts that work in the same way for the same purposes as man-made things. And that is a really powerful testimony. And that is why even this atheist, Richard Dawkins, says in his book explaining why atheism is right, he points out that we are entirely accustomed to the idea that complex elegance is an indicator of premeditated, crafted design. And this is probably the most powerful reason for the belief held by the vast majority of people that have ever lived in some kind of supernatural deity. Because whether people can actually describe it or not intuitively, they see this correspondence between God-made things and man-made things, and they conclude that these things were engineered, and therefore they conclude that there is a God. So in terms of origins, if we have an explanation that is design-based, it is a theistic explanation. In fact, you can say the theism that we see is evidenced by the design that we see in creatures. So design-based explanations are theistic explanations. Point number 1, improve your witness with your friends by pointing out this correspondence, and we as creationists can take our game to the next level by designing our research and our experiments to look for Christ's handiwork. Point number 2, and this is really the guts of this talk, believing that adaptation, and this is important, happens by random mutations and natural selection is inherently anti-theistic because it is inherently and cannot be changed from something that is anti-design. So if it is anti-design in nature, it will be anti-theistic. And that is because when evolutionists see that little baby there, they don't see a completed work. In fact, they don't see any creature as a completed work. They see every feature on every creature as a work in progress. It's not completed. And they see it as a work in progress by the tiny little cumulative adaptations that add up over a long period of time. So it is this accumulation of adaptations which explains how organisms grow, metabolize, reproduce, and adapt. They have a completely different view towards these creatures that we do. And this man right here, Peter Godfrey Smith, he recognizes this. And so he points out that there are some big questions in biology, and this is what they need to answer. The apparent design, he says, of organisms and the relations of adaptation, of adaptedness between organisms and their environment are the big questions, and that's his emphasis, the amazing facts of biology. Explaining this phenomenon, or these phenomena, the core intellectual mission is the core intellectual mission of evolutionary theory. Natural selection is the key to solving these problems. Selection is the big answer. So this is what biology has been about, explaining the apparent design and why organisms fit so well with their environment. And this was the purpose of Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory was not to explain the origin of life. Darwin's theory was not to explain the diversity of life. Darwin's theory was to explain why living creatures look so incredibly designed without reference to a designer. And so he developed a way of interpreting biological phenomena. He developed a way of looking at adaptation and framing what he saw so that what he saw would be interpreted in terms of anti-design. And that is why theory is so important, because theory influences what we see and how we interpret it. And then those interpretations reinforce our theory. Now, how do I know that this is true? Because the former president of the Academy for the American Advancement of Sciences, Francis Ayala, publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, pointed out that Darwin's greatest discovery was design without a designer. And right from the abstract, he says this: with Darwin's discovery of natural selection, the origin and adaptations of organisms was brought into the realm of science. The adaptive features of organisms can now be explained like the phenomena of the inanimate world as the result of natural processes without recourse to an intelligent designer. Now you would be wondering, why would a science journal, one of the leading science journals of the United States, even be publishing such an article? Because evolutionary theory has an agenda. And the agenda is to advance their naturalistic view of the world. He goes on to say this: Darwin's theory of natural selection accounts for the design of organisms. So he's answering one of the big questions: why do organisms look designed without a designer? And for their wondrous diversity as the result of natural processes. And this is what it is. If you are taking notes, this is so important. The accumulation, he doesn't just say the accumulation, the gradual accumulation of spontaneous arisen variations, genetic mistakes, those mutations, that are sorted out by evolution. That is the gist of their theory. Random processes which somehow get acted on in a mysterious way where nature can sort them out. Now, if you're a thoughtful reader, some red flags should be going up in your mind. Random, broken things? Nature acting as if it can think in order to sort stuff out? He goes on to say this: this was Darwin's fundamental discovery, that there is a process that is creative, although not conscious. Thoughtful reader again. Bing, 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 bing. This should be going off in your mind. Have you ever in your life ever seen a creative process that was not conscious? You know, we read over this stuff so quickly, and you hear it in Nova, and you hear it on National Geographic. You should question everything. This makes no sense. And so he is taking people from what they intuitively know, and their own common sense is telling them that when you see something like this, it was put together, and he's trying to get you to believe it was put together by a natural, unconscious process that can act as if it had a brain to sort broken things out. That's the gist of it. And that is why this is really, really a very foolish thinking. But it leads people to incredible changes in their worldview. You've heard of this man, Bertram Russell. He was a famous philosopher, English philosopher. He said way back in 1903, he summarized the implications of Darwinian thinking. He says, but even more purposeless. Now, where's he getting purposelessness? From broken mutations. More void of meaning is the world which science presents for our belief, and he means evolutionary science, that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. It was blind, it was unconscious. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are all but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, adding, quote, that nature, omnipotent but blind, and the revolutions of her secular hurryings through the abysses of space has brought forth mankind with the capacity of judging all the works of his unthinking mother. Is this a worldview? It is a worldview. It's a worldview in which he sees Mother Nature bringing forth human beings in a completely random, chaotic, unthinking process. Now, how does he get to be thinking like that? How does evolutionary thinking tend towards people which initially see creatures, and as Dawkins said, the vast majority of them believe they were created, to where you get people thinking that they are products of a completely random, chaotic process? What are the nuts and bolts that Darwin put into his theory which can change people's thinking in such a radical, counterintuitive way? How does he do it? How do they do it? Well, we need to cover evolutionary theory. So this is the hardest part of the lecture. I need you to look at 4 basic quotes where people are telling us what the basic tenets of evolutionary theory are. These are all 4 different sources. It says the random occurrence of mutations. Please look for repetitive words. Repetitive words giving you a repetitive theme as we cover the basics of evolutionary theory. Here's a foot stomper. The random, boom, boom, boom. The random occurrence of mutations with respect to their consequences is an axiom upon which much of biology and evolutionary theory rests. This simple proposition has had profound effects on models of evolution developed since the modern synthesis, shaping how biologists have thought about and studied genetic diversity over the past century. Basic number 2, the core tenet of the modern synthesis, that is modern evolutionary theory, is that adaptive evolution due to natural selection acting on heritable variability that originates through accidental changes in the genetic material. Such mutations are random in the sense that they arise without reference to their advantages and disadvantages. Number 3, evolutionary theory asserts, evolutionary theory. You've probably never really studied evolutionary theory, what theory really is. These people are telling us. Evolutionary theory asserts that adaptive mutations which improve cellular fitness in challenging environments occur at random and cannot be controlled by the cell. Now stop. What words are coming up over and over again here? Random, accidental, and all of this thing. And they say evolutionary theory asserts that these things are random. Is evolutionary theory asserting this based on observation of real things in nature, or is it asserting it based on its presuppositional views of life? Presuppositional views of life. These assertions, these assumptions are not reflecting what they have discovered. They are reflecting what they already believe. Is that important? You better believe it's important. So that it asserts these things. The assertion that adaptation occurs purely through natural selection of random mutations is deeply embedded in our understanding of evolution. And finally, number 4, a classical or Darwinian evolutionary system. So I'm not giving you trite things. I'm giving you quotes from people who are telling you this is the basics of evolutionary theory. Embodies a basic principle: purposeless genetic variation of reproductive individuals united by common descent coupled with natural selection of those rare individuals that fortuitously express the traits. It's a process replete with chance. So what thing is coming up over and over again? Purposelessness, chance, accidental, all of those things. Now this is really important, because we go back to point number 1. Words are important, and the characteristics that you give to what you are seeing is really important. How you characterize it is really important, because these words convey your ideas of their origins. And so I can't footstop how important it is that the characterizations that evolutionists give to things are vital to their convincing people that they are the product not of God, but of a random, chaotic process. And it is these characterizations which have been the workhorse of evolutionary theory from the beginning, because they set a narrative for decades. So when evolutionists were studying creatures and they saw certain organs that they didn't know what their function was, they characterized those organs as what? Vestigial. Now, is vestigial carrying thoughts of how they think the organ originated? You better believe it is. When they saw DNA that they didn't immediately know the function was, they characterized it as what? Junk. When they characterize it as junk, is it doing work for evolutionary theory? You better believe it is. It is telling you something about how they think it originated. And when they look at certain creatures, which are still alive today, and they classify certain features as primitive features and other creatures as having advanced features, are they telling us what they think about those creatures? You better believe it. So we have been missing this. Their characterizations are what are conveying in people's minds what they think the origins are. Do you think these words have been persuasive to people over the decades? Vestigial, junk, primitive? You better believe they're persuasive to people, especially when they're published in the best scientific papers. But remarkably, there wasn't any compelling scientific evidence that organs were vestigial or the DNA really was junk. Long before you even knew it, they characterized it this way as a propaganda device to get people believing their theory. And this is really important. This is really important. So the words that are characterizing an object as random or a random product, you know what they're also doing? They're conveying evolutionary ideas about their origins at the same time. So let's go back. We're back to the game show. Instead of now looking for the top 8 characteristics of design, we're looking for the top 8 characteristics of anti-design. Anti-design. And all 8 of these words I picked out of scientific literature that I had to find at least 4 times. 4 times. Now, did I say storybooks? I said I found it in what? Scientific literature. Number 1, purposeless. Number 2, random. We can find that out hundreds of times. 3, accidental. 4, trial and error, or another word is hit and miss. Broken, unplanned, cobbled together, and messy. Do you think when people hear that they are a product of these kinds of processes that they start to think differently about their origins? You better believe they do. And so therefore you have this word random mutations. Random mutations, which is repeated ad nauseum. Ad nauseum in scientific literature, almost as a mantra. Mutations occur at random. Even though they don't know that, and they are consistently describing creatures with all of these characteristics, they're sending a message. In addition to that, they say they're sorted out by natural selection. And because of this, they have an unconscious creative force. Broken things sorted by natural selection equals an unconscious creative force, which leads people to a very counterintuitive but a very strong anti-design view that organisms came about via a chaotic and purposeless process. What I am doing is I am trying to take you through the fact that you know that evolutionary thinking tends towards atheism and explain to you how it gets people to see it and think it themselves. So that when this woman hears this over and over again, that process is drilled into her mind. And she is told in scientific literature, it's true, these are broken things. It's true, these are random. It's true that this is a trial and error process. And she is told that natural selection can act like a real human breeder. When she's told that is true, and it's reinforced in the best scientific forums, guess what she begins to think? Wow, That sounds an awful lot like Darwinian evolution. And it doesn't sound like a direct creation by God. Bingo. You've just taken people from seeing something that has all the features of design, and because you've got them to believe that a random chaotic process could produce it, you've got them to believe that this is more consistent with evolution, and it certainly doesn't fit God making these creatures. You know why? Because no rational thinking engineer would use broken things, accidental things, random things. They would never do it. And if no rational human engineer would do this, why would God do it? Does that make sense? And that's how they get people across that. And it is this constant drumbeat, broken, random, accidental, blah, 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 that gets people thinking these things. Wow. So this is how you get the first part. You have this materialistic worldview, which doesn't believe that there's a creator, which, as we read 4 detailed explanations of their theory, they have the assumptions that when they see a genetic change, it's something that is broken. They assume that it is random. They assume that it's a loss of function. They assume all of these things. And because they assume that, when they see them, they characterize them with these descriptors, these anti-design descriptors. And all of those descriptors can be summed up in one word: mutation. Mutation. Mutation in the average mind indicates what? Accidental, broken, blah, 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 blah. And this, right there, is your anti-design element of the mutation selection mechanism. How can you ever make that design-oriented, broken, accidental, blah, 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 blah? How are you ever going to make that fit what a real engineer would do? This is inherently anti-design. And you know what? Every time you and I in this room have ever said the mutation selection mechanism is true but limited, you know what we just did? We just placed ourselves right here. We just placed ourselves in this anti-design realm, playing Darwin's game on Darwin's field by Darwin's rules. And you can never win. You can't win. So we need to abandon this whole idea about mutation, and we need to have some second thoughts about the mutation selection thing. So, in terms of origin of creatures, anti-design is antitheistic by nature, and you can never change it. You know why? Because our Creator reveals himself by the evidences he gives in design. That's why. That's why he does it. So, Darwin's anti-designer view approach to interpreting how organisms act, it reverses the engineering reality of purpose-driven, targeted solutions to hit-and-miss outcomes. That was what we just discussed. It inverts the cause of organism change from the organism itself to the environment, and it personifies nature as exercising pervasive agency that supplants an organism's agency and substitutes itself as the designing agency. Let's look at those next 2. Darwin devised an anti-design explanation by becoming the first one to look at organisms not in terms of what they do themselves, but what the environment does to them. Stephen Jay Gould, probably the world's leading evolutionary theorist, in his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, points out Darwin's theory, in strong and revolutionary contrast, presents the first externalist account of evolution. Darwin overturned all previous traditions by granting the external environment a causal and controlling role in the direction of evolutionary change. Now, what does he mean by that? Gould's colleague, Richard Lawton, explains. For Darwin, the external world, the environment acting on organisms, was the cause of the form of organism. The environment, the external world, with its autonomous properties, was the subject, and the organism was again the object acted upon. You know why he's flipping it around? Because organisms which seem to be able to adjust themselves and adapt themselves sound like they're really, really designed. But if organisms are passive modeling clay which are shaped by their environment, then you can end up getting people to think in terms of this random change. Lewontin goes on to say this: it is from this view of the environment as the cause of organism. It's the cause of organism because it gives life. It's the cause of organism because it gives the diversity of life. That the entire corpus of modern biology arises. We cannot fully appreciate the nature of the change in biology wrought by Mendel through genetics and Darwin through this externalism unless we understand the historical importance of the objectification of the organism. The organism is just an object that is acted on. Two other evolutionists give even more details. He, that is Darwin, accepted the view that the environment directly instructs the organism how to vary, and he proposed a mechanism for inheriting those changes. The organism was like modeling clay, and the remolding of the clay meant each of the billions of little grains was free to move a little bit in any direction and generate form. Do you see what it's saying? If the environment changes and the organism changes, it's not because the organism changed itself, it's because the environment shaped the organism. Organisms become passive. They're molded by the environment. And this greatly changes the view of the power of organisms. In addition to this, Darwin added an upward trajectory. He says because organisms are constantly competing for scarce resources, then there's always a better creature which beats out the weaker creature, which leads to a direction in change. He added Malthus to that. And on top of that, he added the idea that the environment, because the environment is now shaping organisms, that the environment can act like an all-powerful agent. An all-powerful agent. Is this making sense? So he adds this whole idea that nature can act like an agent. The most famous of these statements, Lewontin says, is where Darwin said this, that natural selection, tell me if this doesn't sound like a godlike force. Natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good. Why is this important? This gentleman here, he's not an evolutionist, he's an intelligent design theorist, but he really sums up what Darwin did. When you have all of these random changes, he says that in short, evolutionary biology needs a designer substitute to coordinate the incidental changes that hereditary transmission passes on from one generation to the next. And there's only one naturalistic candidate on the table, to wit, natural selection. Indeed, it is no accident that the word selection and the word intelligence are etymologically related. The lek in selection has the same root as lig in intelligence, both derive from the same Indo-European root meaning to gather and therefore to choose. So what he's saying is this: you have all these random things and you need something to coordinate them. You need something to what? Sort them out. And this force which Darwin gave it has the ability to think. It's intelligent. And the root words even mean the same. He goes on to point out that before Darwin, the ability to choose was largely confined to designing intelligence like we have. That is, to conscious agents that could reflect deliberately on the possible consequences of their choices. Choices like that. Darwin's claim to fame was to argue that natural forces lacking any purposefulness or provision of future possibilities likewise have the power to choose via natural selection. This is the punchline. In ascribing the power to choose to unintelligent natural forces, Darwin perpetuated the greatest intellectual swindle in the history of ideas. Nature has no power to choose. Do you know why? Because nature is not alive. It's not alive. You know who has been swindled by this idea of natural selection? You have. And I have. We've all been swindled. Nature has no power to choose, but we treat it like it does. And therefore, thoughtful atheists pushed back against Darwin because they said all you did was get God's agency out and you put Mother Nature in, i.e. the environment, as an active agent. And Darwin was defensive about this. In 1868, 9 years after he published his book, he said, "The term natural selection is in some respects a bad one, as it seems to imply conscious choice. But this will be disregarded after a little familiarity." You better believe it did. You disregarded it. I disregarded it. Creationists, intelligent design people have disregarded it. I have also often personified the word nature, for I have found it difficult to avoid this ambiguity. You want to know why he personifies the word nature? Because when you look at me and you look at any creature, you're looking at something that looks like it was put together by a thinking brain. And you have to explain that. That's why you personify nature, as if it was a thinking brain. Greg Graffin, evolutionary biologist at UCLA, says the trick is, how do you talk about natural selection without implying the rigidity of law? We use it almost as an active participant, almost like a god. In fact, you could substitute the word God for natural selection in a lot of evolutionary writings, and you think you're listening to a theologian. It's a routine we know doesn't exist. We teach it anyway. Genetic mutations and some active force to choose the most favorable one. Can you see the mysticism in all of this? Can you see the magic which is pervading their thinking? This is very seductive. Robert Reed, he's also passed away, he says, "Indeed, the language of neo-Darwinism is so careless that the words divine plan could be substituted for selection pressure in any popular work in the biological literature without the slightest disruption in the logical flow of the argument." These guys are atheists. They don't like their atheism being tainted by Darwin's magical selector. He goes on to say, selection pressure is now given a metaphorically creative sense by modern biologists who ought to be flagellating themselves for selection pressure. Lynn Margulis, she's also passed away, but she was quoted in this book, The Expose of Evolution Industry. Darwin was brilliant to make natural selection a sort of godlike term, an expression that could replace God. Who did it? Created life forms. He made it easy for his contemporaries to think and verbalize Mr. Big Omnipotent God in the sky, picking out those he wants to keep. He has been conceived of as the natural selector. He throws the others away. This gentleman says natural selection is always doing things. And so we hear about the mechanism of selection as well as the forces or pressures that operate in it. We learn that natural selection shapes the bodies and behaviors of organisms, builds specific features, targets or acts on particular genomic regions, favors or disfavors, or even punishes various traits. Evolutionary biologists routinely speak of natural selection as if it were an agent. Natural selection becomes rather like an occult power of the pre-scientific age. Are you getting the point? Atheists are sick of this whole idea. And this gentleman here in his essay about natural selection said one source of the trouble is that Darwin liked the term natural selection because it could be used as a substantive governing a verb. Now, what does that mean? He treats a concept, natural selection, as if it's a real thing like me that can govern verbs. Can I govern verbs? Can I act? Can I work? Can I choose? Can I cull? Can I weed? Of course, I can do all those things because I have a brain. But he treats a concept as if it were a real thing that could do that stuff. And that's why he says, but such uses appeared to reify, even to deify, natural selection as an agent. You know what this is? You know what this is by any other term? If I held up a statue and I told you it could act, work, favor, blah, 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 you would immediately see it as idolatry. He's holding up nature and saying can do the same thing. And that's why Bertram Russell said, we now can contemplate what Mother Nature did for us. And so this gentleman here pushing back says what breeds the ghost in Darwinism is its covert appeal to intentional biological explanations. Darwin pointed the direction to a thoroughly naturalistic, indeed a thoroughly atheistic theory of phenotype formation, but he didn't see how to get the whole way there. He killed off God, if you like, but Mother Nature and other pseudo-agents, and he's talking about selection, got away scot-free. We think it's now time to get rid of them too. You know what? It is. And this is how you see it in evolutionary literature. Here's one, New Scientist, Intelligent Evolution, how life's processes act like an all-knowing brain. Here's another one, Nature's Brain, a radical new view of evolution. How does natural selection create so much complexity so fast? A bold new theory says it learns and remembers past solutions, just as our brains do. Here's a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, gene cooption. It's explaining how you got oxygen carrying capacity in jawed and jawless fishes, but this is how they end their scientific paper. This example of convergent evolution of protein function provides an impressive demonstration of the ability of natural selection to cobble together complex design solutions by tinkering with different variations of the same basic protein scaffold. This is how they get people thinking that we're the product of these blind forces. Well, then someone will come up and say, well, yeah, I agree that this is abuse, but if you just use the correct definition of natural selection, if you just turn to Webster's, you could get it. But Michael Hodge says a quite general issue has still received no canonical treatment. What kind of thing is natural selection anyway? A law, a principle, a force, a cause, an agent? All or some of these things. You know why nobody can define what it is? Because it's a concept. It's a concept that's given human-like powers. It's a concept that's given God-like powers. That's why they can't define it. This gentleman, Jerry Fulder, he's also dead. He says the present worry is that the explication of natural selection by appeal to selective breeding is seriously misleading. In other words, when Darwin said nature can act like a human breeder, he's misleading you because human breeders have a brain, but nature doesn't. And that it thoroughly misled Darwin. What then is the intended interpretation when one speaks of natural selection? The question is wide open as of this writing. So what did Darwin do? Well, Darwin, he made the analogy that nature could act on creatures like a human breeder, but it can't, because humans have a brain, but nature doesn't. He projects real selective capability onto nature, which means he's projecting onto it intelligence, which it doesn't. And Darwin was the one, nobody else, who coined the term natural selection. So let's close the map here on how this works. We already saw how this mutation summarizes all of this chaotic thinking, which is the anti-design. Well, in selection, you begin with the same materialistic worldview, and you have the assumption that nature can act like a human breeder, that nature has all of those abilities as a breeder. And because they believe that nature can act like a human breeder, they ascribe to nature all of these abilities to favor, work on, act on. Another man says natural selection can see, select, save, and build. And because of all of that, you now have a mystical substitute agent. This is how you get people believing in this counterintuitive view, where you have an anti-design setup over here, and you have a mystical substitute agent there, that you get people from believing when they see creatures that they were created to believing that they are the product of a chaotic, mindless force of nature. And that's how you take them towards atheistic thinking. This is how it works on all of that. So what would happen to this whole concept of mutation selection if we dumped the word mutation and we replaced it with this, a directed genetic change? And what happens if we dumped the word selection and replaced it with successful solutions? In other words, creatures have directed genetic change which successfully solve problems. The entire power, the anti-design power, completely disappears. So what I'm saying to you is everything in evolutionary thinking is boiling down to this whole idea of mutation and selection, which takes me to the last point, which very short, fortunately. We'll be able to wrap up here in just a couple minutes. Mutation, selection, style explanations really harm both science and theology. Let's consider a non-illustration. Ooh, I hate to read this. This was ICR's explanation for cavefish, which we had in our original museum. Read what we said. As genetic information is copied and passed on generation after generation, occasionally there are copying mistakes known as mutations. Mutations have been observed to destroy, damage, and corrupt genetic information or to be neutral, but have never been observed to add new information. This is true even of so-called beneficial mutations that may be advantageous to the surviving organism in some creatures. When a mutation occurs in a light environment that causes animals' offspring not to have eyes, it's an enormous disadvantage. So natural selection eliminates this flaw. When the eyeless defect occurs here, that is in a cave, it does not give any disadvantage, so it is not eliminated. In fact, it gives advantages. Those eyes can crash into things, injuring the eyes and get diseases of the eyes, possibly leading to death. Eventually, selective pressures ensure that all are eyeless. These ghostly fish are prime examples of how mutation and natural selection lead to a reduction of functioning systems. These adaptations are no evidence at all for the belief that complexity has arisen by such processes. They only show how information can be lost in a fallen world. How many of you have ever repeated that? How many of you have been saying that? Why not? We taught it. So let's go over and sum up what we just said. We just said that surface-dwelling features gradually morphed into cave-dwelling forms due to random genetic mutations, which led to broken systems, through a purposeless trial and error process of death and survival that resulted in a loss of information that produced depigmentation and blindness, and selection pressure ensured that all are blind. Why are you laughing? Because we just basically repeated what? Darwin's mechanism. All we did was repeat it. We just repeated it. But then we put the caveat, but this shows how you can break something but not make something. Do you see what we did? We jumped in and we played Darwin's game on Darwin's field by Darwin's rules. And that's why we haven't killed this after 50 years of teaching against it, because we basically said everything he said was true. And once you get into that, you can't win. You can't win. And so for years we've basically been saying, well, Darwin's mechanism is true, but it's inconsistent, or it's insufficient, or it's incomplete, or it's inaccurate. But the moment we say his mutation selection mechanism is true, we've lost. For all the reasons I just gave you up to this point. And that's why, by jumping into that, the details, it derails scientific research by not looking for non-random changes. And only once we broke away from it did we start to develop a continuous environmental tracking model, which assumes that organisms are as engineered and much, much, much more than this car, and we're looking for corresponding system elements, believing that they can be explained by engineering principles. We start looking for non-random changes and we start to find them. We had to break away because it was derailing us. Second, it derails scientific search by not looking for the not broken. So when it came to cavefish, the question is, does a broken system cause cavefish depigmentation? Is the fact that they are now these hypopigmented things because the systems which lead to pigmentation, are they all broken in this fish? So we started to look. And we took this blind cavefish and we put it back in river conditions under real sunlight, and in 32 days it looked like this. Same fish in both pictures. Was the pigmentation system broken? Obviously it wasn't. It derailed us. Completely derailed us. Mutations for adaptation, no rational engineer would use it. So no wonder people start to question whether God really created us. Theistic selectionism, it's just the creationists' light version of real evolution. That's why it's bad. It personifies nature as if it's causal, which means that we jump into the same realm as the idolatrous pseudo-creator, the great selector. That's bad for theology. 6, natural selection, we always said it's not a creative process, it's a conservative process. Do you know what that meant when we were saying that? It meant this. God created this to operate after the fall so that some of you, when your children have genetic mutations, they will die before they reach reproductive age, and that saves the rest of this population from getting their genetic mutations. That's what we're saying. That's pretty gross. But that's what we were saying. And number 7, we said that we agreed with Gould's perverse indeed idea. In other words, Gould was smart enough to realize that Darwin was after something more than just the diversity of life. He wanted to mock God. And people, when they look at creatures, they see evidences of his goodness, his love, his wisdom, and his power. But what Darwinian thinking says is that everything that you thought was good and that demonstrated the goodness of God really came about through a blind struggle for life and death, where one creature destroys and leads to the extinction of another creature, all for its own selfish advancement. And he says this mocks the Creator God, and he's right. In addition, he has the substitute idolater. So this is why this whole thinking harms. It harms us in many ways.